Philipo Arnoldo is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Religion at Syracuse University, as well as a core faculty member of Native American and Indigenous Studies. He is the director of the SCANO Great Law of Peace Center, which repurposes the site that formerly celebrated the Jesuits coming to Onondaga Nation territory in 1656 to 1658. The new center now tells the ancient story for the formation of the Longhouse tradition, known as the Great Law of Peace at Onondaga Lake, and its influences on American culture. The SCANO Great Law of Peace Center is a collaborative enterprise between the Onondaga Nation, Onondaga County, the Onondaga Historical Association, Syracuse University, and 4 other educational institutions in the Syracuse area. His books are Eating Landscape, Aztec and European Occupation of Tlalocan, Sacred Landscapes and Cultural Politics, Planting a Tree, The Gift of Sports, Indigenous Ceremonial Dimensions of the Games We Love, and Urgency of Indigenous Religions. He's a member of Neighbors of the Onondaga Nation, an organization of the Syracuse Peace Council. In 2007, he organized the Doctrine of Discovery Study Group to discuss the legacy of Christianity in the destruction of indigenous peoples. He's the president of the Indigenous Values Initiative, which is a nonprofit organization to support the work of the SCANO Great Law of Peace Center and other organizations and initiatives to educate the general public about the indigenous values of the Haudenosaunee. Sandra Victory is an enrolled member of the Mohawk Nation at Akwesasne. Born in Syracuse, she performed weekly on local radio and TV from age 3 to 18. Her band performed locally throughout the 1970s. In early 80s, she toured with the American Indian Community Houses Theater Troupe in New York City, also appearing at La Mama Theater. From 1983 to 85, she was administrative assistant to the American Indian Law Support Center at the Native American Rights Fund in Boulder, Colorado. This experience clarified the unique sovereign status that the Onondaga Nation holds internationally, which sets them apart from the federally imposed Bureau of Indian Affairs governments that are under the guardianship of the U.S. Since returning to Syracuse, she has helped organize the 2-Row Conference in 1996, Roots of Peacemaking in 2006, and Doctrine of Discovery Conference in 2014. She co-edited the noñh booklet, is on the planning committee for SCANO, the Great Law of Peace Center, and is a board member of the Indigenous Values Initiative.
Okay.
Welcome to Lithuania.
Yes, right. So I'm going to stand so I can see you. Okay. That's the tradition of the Haudenosaunee when the speaker stands. So what I'd like to do is I'll speak very slowly. I'm very sorry not to know Lithuanian. I think most people can understand English. I will try to keep it simple. Really, this is going to be an introduction to Native American studies and issues of indigenous peoples in the United States, which is quite different. I've come to learn and appreciate it's very different from the Lithuanian and European situation. For example, decolonization is a very important aspect of Native American studies in the U.S. Colonization is a legacy of the past, and Native people suffered enormous trauma from colonization. So decolonization is an ongoing struggle for Native people. And that's a theme that we've necessarily had to focus on in the Scano Great Law Peace Center. Okay? I'll talk about Scano in a minute. But first, I just wanted to say, Nyawen Scano. This is a welcoming greeting in the Onondaga language, which is the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois, as they're commonly known. I'll explain that a little more, but Nyawen Scano means thank you for being well. Right? Scano also means peace, peace and wellness. So, achu. That's about the extent of my Lithuanian. I'm really moved to be here, part of this group who is so devoted and dedicated to the health of the earth, the health of Mother Earth. That's something that is quite moving for us to see. And thank you for inviting us as outsiders to this gathering. This is probably something, this would be, you know, Monty Python? It's sort of like now something completely different, right? And so thank you for inviting us to be part of your gathering. I want to open with this idea, and this is what motivates probably many of us here, the urgency of our times. We're in the midst of what many Native people call a time of prophecy, because there's great upheaval in the earth. Climate change is going to come at us hard and heavy in the next few years, I think very soon. And it seems to us, and this is what we've dedicated ourselves to, is to introducing people to indigenous values. So that maybe there can be some effort to reacquaint ourselves, us modern people, with the rhythms of the earth, the values of the earth. So this is what the Scano Center is devoted to. Okay, so the Haudenosaunee are actually the word that has been used. They're wrongly referred to as the Iroquois, or Six Nations, or but originally they're a confederation of 5 separate individual nations that make up the Haudenosaunee. And that just simply means people of the longhouse, or people who build the longhouse. This is the wampum belt, an ancient wampum belt. This is an example of wampum. It's a worked shell bead, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But this is an ancient wampum belt that was created at Onondaga Lake over 1,000 years ago. That signifies the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, which is the central tree, Cayuga, and Seneca. And then the Tuscarora, the 6th nation, joined in the 18th century. I'll talk about this in a minute too, but among Native American nations, or tribes as they're called in the U.S., the Haudenosaunee have the last traditional governments. That is, they're not run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs or the PIA. They're still run by their traditional clan system, longhouse system, that was founded at Onondaga Lake. They've influenced Western democracy. They sat in council with the founding fathers of the United States. They influenced the women's movement in the 19th century. And also my favorite, we'll talk about this, they've also influenced the current game of the cross, or Dehon Chikwais, which is what they call it. All right? Everything okay so far? All right. So oftentimes I introduce Sandy because she will correct me liberally right during the talk. So that's the way things are done among the Haudenosaunee. The women speak if we get things wrong. So I have to introduce her because some people think it's a heckler in the audience or something, right? So, anyway.
Viskas gerai? Lakrosas yra žaidimas, yra sporto žaidimas, Haudenosaunee, su pagaliais, kurie atrodo kaip eiti kažkokią žuvį gaudyti arba krabus kokius, su tinkleliu tarp. Tai yra jų šventas žaidimas, kuris yra įrašytas, yra dalis jų mitologijos ir pasaulio kūrybos. Tai žaidimas, kuris yra apie priešingų jėgų veiklą pasaulio kūrimą. Tai yra dvyniai, vienas geras dvynys, kitas blogas dvynys, arba vienas yra vadinamas gera sąmonė, o kitas yra toks daugiau kaip velniukiškas, šelmiškas. Tai dvi jėgos, kaip daugumoje jėgų, kurios sukuria pasaulį, čia yra jos antropomorfinės, ačiū. Ir žaidimas irgi yra iškilęs iš to mito pasaulio. Ir jiems tai yra šventas ir gydantis žaidimas. Ir dabar lakros yra labai paplitęs Amerikoje. Ir netgi labai sukomercializuotas. Jis yra ir tradicinis, ir modernus. Ir jų du sūnus, Clay ir Croy, žaidžia lakrosą, labai geri lakrosą žaidėjai.
Yeah, there's a few pictures of them in this too. Okay, so the Onondaga Nation Longhouse. So in the United States, there's about 565 federally recognized tribes, as they're called, in the United States. Yes, and they're defined as tribes in the U.S. The Haudenosaunee reject that notion, right? Only 3 continue to govern themselves in the pre-American system, or the traditional system of government, and all 3 are Haudenosaunee. Onondaga is the central fire, or sort of the capital, Washington, D.C. Actually, Washington, D.C. was modeled on Onondaga. It's the central fire and is expressed as the central tree. Into the roots of the tree are thrown the weapons of war, right? So this is the great tree of peace, and it's surrounded by the clan animals. These are matrilineal clans run by women. And surrounding that are the 50 clan chiefs holding hands. So I won't go into this too much detail, but there are sort of 3 moments in Haudenosaunee history that they emphasize. The first is the creation, Thanksgiving address, these ancient protocols that came to them from the Creator. Second is the Great Law of Peace, which was established at Onondaga Lake in Syracuse, New York, about at least 1,000 years ago, probably longer. And they're organized in matrilineal clans. And then third, in the late, say 1799 into 1815 or so, was the Gyvybinis, or the Code of Handsome Lake, as it's translated into English. I'll talk a little bit about the Thanksgiving address, I think, but this is among their first instructions. So the Thanksgiving address opens and closes every meeting of the Haudenosaunee, and it sometimes can go on for hours, long time, depending on who's giving it and what the topic is. But it opens and closes all meetings. So we won't do that today.
The Haudenosaunee do not pray. They give thanksgiving to the natural world and all the beings in the natural world and in the sky world. They don't pray and ask for healing. They acknowledge gratefulness.
So it's a way of acknowledging the gifts that have already been given. That's why it's a Thanksgiving. So, you know, the water gives you gifts, so you acknowledge the water. And it goes through the different elements of creation, starting with people and all the way through. So it can last a very long time. And it's not a prayer. So this is the site that we have repurposed. Used to be called St. Marie among the Iroquois, and commemorated the coming of the Jesuits to Onondaga Lake. The Jesuits were only there 20 months at Onondaga Lake, from 1656 to 1658. But then it went out of business, because more and more people started to learn about the Haudenosaunee and what the longer history was of Onondaga Lake. The French fort was built, the replica of the fort was built in 1933, and it's really iconic in Syracuse.
No one spoke of the fort of 1656 until 1933.
It was expanded into a living museum, but the Onondaga Nation had no involvement with it because they felt it was a violation of their territory, right? So this was a colonization of their territory. It closed in 2011, so what we did, Sandy and I and others, repurposed it, calling it the Scano Great Law Peace Center. And this is the first time the Onondaga Nation had been at their sacred lake in over 200 years. So it really creates a presence for them back at their sacred lake. Something else you have to know is Onondaga Lake is the most chemically polluted lake in the country, in the U.S. The second most chemically polluted lake in the world after Chernobyl. So it's that kind of conflict of worldviews at Onondaga Lake, sacred but filthy. Jane Goodall, you know, the famous primatologist, she came to Onondaga Lake and said, sacred but filthy. It sort of rang in my head. So I think it's a very powerful place for a lot of reasons. I won't go through this. Agluta already mentioned the collaboration. A collaboration is really hard. I've learned that over the last 5 years. Collaborating with these different, so Onondaga Nation and Onondaga County share the same name, but they don't like one another very much, okay? So trying to hold that collaboration together has been a strain.
Well, government took them and used the name Onondaga.
Right. So it's our government that took over. But Syracuse University, where I am, Lemoyne College is a Jesuit college in the area, and they've been very important collaborators because it's a former Jesuit site, right? And they're interested in making apologies for the past. So that's a very important element of the Peace Center. So this is just to review, but so there's what's culturally distinctive is it's a sacred place for the Haudenosaunee. This is a famous painting by Oren Lyons. It shows Tadadaho, this very powerful sorcerer, cannibal, evil man, being convinced of the ways of peace by Hiawatha, you probably heard that name, Iolenta, and the peacemaker. And so this depicts kind of that moment when the Tadadaho's body was straightened, snakes fell from his hair. It's a wonderful story. In fact, they're telling it now, right now, as we're speaking, in longhouses across New York. And we also have a fort.
In Canada.
Yeah, in Canada. So we actually have a fort. And little boys love forts, you know. So we have these old men that grew up with the fort, coming back to the fort, but it's got a whole new message.
Where's the fort?
It's right in our backyard. So
No,
we.
no, in Syracuse.
Oh, it's in Syracuse.
So what is it, Canada?
It is
You
what?
mentioned something about Canada.
Oh, well, the Haudenosaunee expand all throughout
That's a
Canada
good question.
and New York State. That territory had no borders.
You know, I forgot, I didn't put a map in, but this is a map of New York State, okay? It's hard to see. New York City is down here, right? This would be Albany, Niagara Falls, right? And then this depicts the longhouse of the Haudenosaunee. So Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, Senecas, okay, across the state. Now they've been moved, you know, into Canada, which is up here, Canada. These are the Great Lakes, Erie, Ontario, and so now they're spread out all over because of removal. They're in Wisconsin, out west, all over.
But this is when the Five Nations, they had territories in Canada, almost to the Mississippi River, and then south into the Carolinas. They had influence over that huge expanse of the New World. And they were very influential. They were peacemakers, and that's who the Europeans first encountered when they came a little farther west, you know, the British discoverers
Yeah.
and the Jesuits. And,
So now there are longhouses across the country, you know, and what they do is they get together and recite the Great Law of Peace, that story, and it takes them a week to do it. And they do it in their language, so it's a rather complicated process, and they're trying to bring that back. And we're trying to help with that if we can. Let me go ahead. Yeah. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what elements we have. So Scano means peace and wellness, but the idea is that peace can only be realized between people if you're in harmony with the natural world. Okay? You can't have peace if you're not in harmony with the natural world. So that's what the Thanksgiving address is about, right? That's what all their protocols and ceremonies, Thanksgivings, are about. So it's a little different than our standard notion of peace, right? Just as being not at war, right? So then we did these interviews. Sandy and I did these interviews with traditional people. We filmed 30 hours of interviews, and we asked them, what do they want to say to the rest of the world, right? And what we did was we had to edit 30 hours of interviews down to 6 4-minute videos, because that's the attention span of most people now. You know, they can only watch a video for 4 minutes. And so we have 6 4-minute videos that go, but presented from the point of view of the Haudenosaunee themselves. So Scano is the first piece. So I guess what's funny is that it's this high-tech environment of videos, touch screens, that sort of thing, which help people to get a first-hand view of the Haudenosaunee. The first is Scano, then the Thanksgiving address, which translates literally the words that come before all else. Then the creation story. The natural world prepares a place for human beings. Then the Great Law of Peace story, which is of the peacemaker, Chigonsace, which is the mother of clans, Hiawatha Tadadaho, and that's the story at Onondaga Lake. Then we talk about European contact, because the current Tadadaho, so Tadadaho is now an office. The current Tadadaho, which we worked with very closely on this, said that this has to be their Holocaust museum as well. So that's where the whole issue of colonization comes in. So with 1492, I really don't know what people are educated in Lithuania. We talk about Columbus, but Columbus is a big topic in American education. Okay, that's sort of when the world starts, and what we're trying to do is tell people that that's false. Okay.
Gal tiktai paklausime klausytojų, ar bus kokių klausimų, ar reikia truputėlį, taip sakant, sustoti, ar, taip sakant, pakankamai supratimo yra kol kas viskas gerai, ne? Gerai, tada pratęsime.
Oh, okay. I was worried you weren't going to get my jokes, you know. That was what I heard, but now I can hear that, you know, people are understanding, you know. That's where I get it. So European contact is associated with the difficult periods. And I'm going to talk more about this because it's related to the missionary fort, the Jesuit presence, is the doctrine of Christian discovery. Also, Turo Wampum, colonialism, boarding schools, which is not a very nice period in Native history, and some other things. Then we conclude on more of an upbeat note that there are Haudenosaunee influences. Western democracy comes out of this polluted little lake, Onondaga Lake. Who knew? Nobody knows in the U.S. mostly. And yet we think this is a very important story. The women's movement was influenced. Women's movement in upstate New York begins in 1848 with the first Women's Rights Convention. And all those women were influenced by the clan mothers of the Haudenosaunee. Lacrosse, environment, food, and also they've been at the forefront of work for indigenous peoples at the United Nations. Since really 1920s. So it's a lot of ground to cover, you know, millennia. So I'm just going to go through some photos, okay? So you can kind of see. This is the Nyawen Scano. This is a clan mother welcoming people to the center. Some of the people you'll see. The Thanksgiving address. Aganyaheno in Onondaga, and there are 18 different elements always in the Thanksgiving address.
It can sometimes take hours to recite.
What's the
It's a Thanksgiving.
The address. Oh, I'm sorry.
And if there's an important meeting and they need to bring everybody to agreement, they go through the Thanksgiving address. It can take hours because it's a process of establishing a good mind. So people are not self-centered, human beings are not in charge of the world. And so this really lengthy address kind of brings you to this level that you're in harmony with the natural world.
So after each piece, each segment, for example, you're thanking the water, and you say, thank you for the water to keep us alive and all that. And then you say, now our minds are one. And then they move to the next, you know. And then there's an agreement, right? We have a little example of that we can show. Then the creation story. So the creation story has many different elements. Again, it's something that takes a week long to recite, but we had to reduce it to 4 minutes, you know. You do violence to these long epic stories in order for people to really appreciate. We try to get people to appreciate the values that are in these stories.
But what is the special point is that when Sky Woman was falling to the turtle that was in this water, the sea creatures and other beings saw her coming and broke her fall, and she was pregnant. So they created the earth for her to survive. So that's part of the notion of being grateful, because human beings would not have ever formed had it not been for the natural world.
And then there's a part of the story we love, which is not pictured here. In the creation story, it has to do with twins. So many creation stories have to do with twins. As you mentioned, we have twins. But, you know, they were relabeled good and evil. And we didn't, by the Jesuits, and we didn't like that, you know, because we didn't think it worked very good as a parenting practice to basically say you're good and you're evil. But we've come to discover that the twin story in creation is more like the yin and yang of the Taoist, you know, healing, cosmology, right? So the twins are always in opposition, night and day, earth and sky, and they're the ones who play lacrosse. Okay, so that's the oppositions are about the game of lacrosse. And then we get to this time of great violence between the clans here. So there's violent times among the Haudenosaunee, and then into that arrives the peacemaker on a white stone canoe, who convinces all these different groups that they need to throw away their weapons of war and establishes the great law of peace. Yes, of course.
Okay. All right, so the five the clans all began bickering with one another, and then that led to warfare eventually. So they were constantly at war, and everybody was heavy with grief and sorrow, because that's what creates war, because you have no good mind. Your mind is all disturbed. So the peacemaker came to show a way back to establishing peace. And the first person he encountered on his journey was a woman, and she became the mother of clans. So it was first important to reassign the clans to everybody, so they would be related to the earth animals and sky animals. And then their naming and everything goes through the clan. Then the women choose the leaders. And they can take them also out of leadership if they're not, behaving with a good mind. So then he had to move on and get more and more people on board, and Tecumseh helped in that. And they brought all the 5 nations together, and then lastly, they had to confront the Tadadao, who had the snakes in his hair, and he was cannibalistic, and he was the worst, because they knew there would be no peace if they could not turn his mind as well. And in the process of doing that, he first absolved grief with Hiawatha, who was had lost all his daughters. And the process of alleviating all that grief was the use of wampum.
This here?
And so, and then you say those three, the brushing.
Yeah, so the condolence ceremony is the way they raise leaders into, male leaders into their positions of leadership. So they have to condole each leader, and that's the ones that have the horns. And that condolence, there are 13 strings of wampum, and they correspond with different pieces of the different elements of the body. And the three that are emphasized are that with one string and the words of wampum, you take the lump away from the throat of grief so you can speak. Or you take, with another string, you take the dust of death away from the ears so you can hear. Or with another string, you take away the tears, wipe away the tears from the eyes so you can see. So grief is what keeps us. And one chief who went all over the world planting trees, these peace trees, he would give this condolence ceremony. He's now passed away. But he said that he figures about 80% of the world, or 85% of the world, is in grief, been separated from the natural world. So this reestablishes appropriate relationships between human beings and the natural world, so we can be fully functional again. So this is a long process, was developed at Onondaga Lake, and is continuing now today. This is just an installation depicting the first condolence between Hiawatha, who was in grief, and the peacemaker. This is Sandy. We have this great kind of fashioned great tree of peace.
With all the clans.
With all the clans on the, it's difficult to see. So you have to come see it.
Mes turim klausinėti, ką reiškia condolence?
Condolence tai yra kaip užuojauta. Grief yra gedulas ir condolence yra užuojauta.
Bet duoda kažką materialaus.
Materialaus, jo, bet duoda va to kriaulytės. Tai yra vakuum. Tai yra iš kriauklyčių padarytas toks kaip juosta, iš kriauklyčių liemenių juostas. Jo, ir tada atskiria dalį tos juostos tokie kaip karoliukai, ne? Iš kriauklyčių. Jo, ir jie materialiai kažkaip tai išvalo išvalo gedulą. Nes vis tiek tos kriauklytės yra vandens elemento, ir jos yra materialios, jas galima rasti. Could you elaborate about how they handle the wampum strings when they do condolence ceremony? Do they touch them?
Yeah, they touch them. I talk a little more about it later, but the wampum strings are still used every day. Maybe we could pass it around. So this is not a bead. So usually they're beads with holes, but this is the shell, quahog shell.
So it has the power to heal, let's say, this kind of physical symptom, somatic symptom.
Yeah, that with words. So with the words and the wampum.
Ceremony.
Yeah.
Right together with this.
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
And all clan chiefs carry strings of wampum with them all the time. Different belts will be going into.
Yeah, well, and then, so, but it's very important to know the origins of wampum to understand their process, because they use it every day. I once had a chief who came and spoke in my class, and he pulled out his wallet, pulled out the wampum string, as if it were his ID, it's like, this is who I am. And it was basically his title on the wampum string.
Are you talking about titles at all in this talk?
Not yet. I mean, go ahead. Not later. No, go
No,
ahead.
okay. So what happened is when all the original 50 clan chiefs were given names, those names remain titles, so that today there are 50 clan chiefs that carry the same name from thousands of years ago when the peacemaker came. And they represent that whole line. For
So the leader gives to the next leader to,
yes.
but I mean when they make peace, when they meet leader with leader, or leader can give this condolence to anybody. How it's organized?
The condolence to anybody. Well, this is how they raise chiefs. They have condolence ceremonies among themselves.
Right. Right.
So they don't share a lot of the tradition in the outside world because of colonialism. Divisions were made within every nation with Christianity because they don't acknowledge the traditional people. So that's where new leaders came into every other territory through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is more like a United States government forced on indigenous people. So those leaders are always Christianized, and they don't adhere to these traditions.
But there are.
There are traditional people all over the country,
Yeah.
but they're not recognized by the United States. They have no power in their territories. And most of the Christian leaders make fun of them or ignore them or
So, but there are ways of condoling people that are not specifically about raising chiefs too, right? So there are condolence ceremonies for a wider public, you know.
and they're showing ways back through
Right.
the Thanksgiving address. What they
Right.
share is a progression to this.
I think Ilona wants to know if one can receive condolence on an individual level, the way
Yeah.
that let's say one goes to a therapist or a psychotherapist and gets some kind of counseling, right? That's your question.
I think so. Maybe more ceremony.
Yeah.
Well, that
Small
would be it.
amount.
That would be
Yeah.
it. But it would be outside of like the official, you know, raising of the chiefs.
Yes, but there's like secret societies,
Sure.
medicine societies, and there's smaller groups,
Mhm.
and there's all kinds of ritual.
Okay, so so this is the gathering of good minds at Onondaga Lake. That's how they refer to the first, the coming together of the Great Law of Peace. This is a wampum gathering, or a gallery, sorry. So these are replicas of wampum belts. So they would take the strings and create these belts. You know, remember the Hiawatha belt, the Confederacy belt. I'll talk about that later. That's here. This is the Everlasting Tree wampum belt. This is the Tadadaho belt. So there are different belts that hold these processes that were made thousands of years ago at Onondaga Lake. It's all done in wampum though.
And where those belts are practically used, or just a symbol on the architecture, or
Yeah.
where are they?
No, it's good. I'm going to talk about that in a bit, you know, but Onondaga holds this belt. It was returned from an anthropology museum about 30 years ago or less. It's now their flag, so you'll see this belt at Standing Rock, for example. I've got a picture of that. So you'll see it in different places around the world, that depiction of that belt. But most people don't know it comes from a wampum belt, which has these very old relationships. People of the longhouse, so we have a little model of a longhouse. I like this one because, well, so when Grand Council comes together at Onondaga, this is what impressed the founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, you know, the founders of Western democracy. They sat in council with the Haudenosaunee, particularly the Onondaga, 1755, 1770s, and they would talk to them in Philadelphia. At Onondaga, in the Grand Council, when all the clans are coming together, the little brothers and the older brothers and the younger brothers would sit across the longhouse from one another. The Onondaga were at one end, not saying anything, so they would debate across the fire. They still do this. One end is Onondaga and also Tadada. So these are impressed on the different divisions of government, right? So you have the Senate, Congress, the judicial branch of government, and the executive, right, with Tadada. So this is what influenced the development of Western democracy. Something that I'll talk more about a little later is the doctrine of discovery, which is something I think you might also be interested in. But it's very important among indigenous peoples now around the world, and particularly in the U.S. This is the first wampum with Europeans, wampum belt, called the two-row wampum belt, Gaswenta. And what it depicts is that Europeans, this was the Dutch, who was struck with the Dutch in Albany. So the Dutch in their boat, in their ship, and the Haudenosaunee in their canoe should flow down the river of life side by side and not interfering with one another. And the three white beads, white rows of beads, correspond to the agreements. There's really cohabitational agreement, right? It didn't work out, of course, but that was the idea in 1613. This is where the Haudenosaunee, I've got a better photo of this later. This depicts the Sullivan-Clinton campaign, which was an assault on the Haudenosaunee by George Washington, 1779. So this is part of the genocide piece of the museum. And then in 1794, George Washington created a wampum belt. This is a replica of the wampum belt and a treaty with the Haudenosaunee in 1794, referred to oftentimes as the mother of all treaties. This is another prophet among the Haudenosaunee called Handsome Lake.
Well, Al mentioned something about Handsome Lake. He made a trip to Thomas Jefferson because everybody was trading for pelts and only trading alcohol for all the other goods that they were getting from all the Haudenosaunee. And so Handsome Lake went and said, we no longer want you doing this. Our alcohol is making our people sick. And so that was a big heart behind Handsome Lake's movement, was trying to make his people well, eliminate all the alcohol.
So now in the United States and Canada, there's an attempt to, it's Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that are discussing the consequences of boarding schools among Native people. Both in Canada and the U.S., these places were rife with all kinds of abuse against Native people. Essentially, they were punished if they spoke their language, if they performed any ceremonies, their hair was cut, they were put in military-style uniforms. These were often run by Christian denominations or by the federal government. And so the legacy of boarding schools has had an effect on all kinds of Native people. It's a tremendous trauma. And they, the last one closed in about 1990. So really, Native American religion was against the law in the United States until 1978, when Congress signs the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. So you've got to give you some sense of how difficult it was. I mean, 78 for me is not so long ago, right? But for young children, young kids.
And their names were taken away, native names and
Exactly.
Catholic names.
Right. And Sandy's family suffered with the boarding schools as well. So this is a
2-year-old, right?
But the church did that first, assigned Christian names right from the beginning, renaming everything like lacrosse, calling the Haudenosaunee Iroquois. That happened in the 17th century forward. And in doing that renaming, instead they were switching over the matrilineal line, because the clan mothers would give a name to a child, and it would be a clan name. And she held those names. And there'd only be one person that would have that name until they died. Then they would give it back to the clan mother, and then when a new child was born, that child would get that name. And along with the name came a song. And if it was handed down in the family, it could be that, or the child, if they were musical, they could create eventually their own song. And they're told when they go in the woods to sing the song, and speak their language, because then the natural world will recognize you. So when the church came in, they gave Christian names and assigned the father's name to the whole family. And once you do that, you become distanced from your clan mother and from your clan chief. And so that starts the separation of identity. And it started in the 17th century.
So this is all tied to the movement from the mid-1800s until really contemporary times, what they call assimilation. So Native people were forced to assimilate, to become white, essentially. And this is something that is still very difficult to deal with. So then finally we talk about resilience, the survival of the Haudenosaunee, which is a story in and of itself. As I mentioned, the roots of Western democracy in Onondaga Lake. Tehonchiquais, or lacrosse. These are quite famous lacrosse players from Onondaga, called the Thompson brothers. This is an example of a wooden lacrosse stick. I have more examples of that. So important is sovereignty for the Onondaga, that they travel on their own passports. They're the only indigenous group of people who travel with their own papers. So they have their own passports, and their team, lacrosse team, called the Iroquois Nationals, competes internationally. Next summer, they're in Israel, but they won't travel unless Israel will accept their passport. So this is a very interesting kind of phenomenon. This is hard to see, but it's the women's movement in the U.S., protecting Mother Earth, international work through the United Nations. Sandy and I support through our nonprofit organization, Indigenous Values Initiative. We support the work of the Haudenosaunee at the UN. Every spring, there's a big event called the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, where indigenous people from all over the world gather in New York City. And it's really led by the Haudenosaunee. So we have people from Latin America. Sometimes those people are killed when they return. So it's a very risky thing. Sami they've been very active in the UN right since the 70s. So this has been an ongoing effort to have people understand about Indigenous issues. And we work very closely with Betty Lyons, who is the executive director of American Indian Law Alliance. This is a famous man, Orrin Lyons, who is discussing his painting called The Three Sisters. There's so much to talk.
Three Sisters
So,
Garden,
yeah, they would be interested in that too. So this is now the flag, okay? So you can recognize this around the world. It's the Hiawatha Wampum Belt, or the Confederacy Belt. Here it is at Standing Rock. So you will see this flag all over the place. I'm sure you've heard of Standing Rock. And this is also a prophecy among Native people out west about the black snake. And so this was very unifying, the Standing Rock event for Indigenous peoples around the U.S. and I think around the world as well, because it was simple. Water is sacred, right? You have to protect the water. So I think that's kind of where we're moving now. I mentioned this. This is an artist's depiction of Kennesatego, an Onondaga chief, addressing Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and the rest. They would travel to Pennsylvania, or Lancaster, and other places. They were regulars at these conventions. Yeah.
Kennesatego went down in, let's see,
I think it's might be 17.
that's 17.
I think so.
Okay, wait a minute. Okay. I'm thinking 1923, that was Biscayne went to the UN in Geneva in 1923, very concerned that the treaties were not being respected by the United States. And it made quite a stir, and he was published all over Europe, but we didn't hear much about that in the United States. And he returned, but happy that he established presence in Geneva. In 1924, 1 year later, the United States bestowed citizenship on all Native people in the U.S. And so the Haudenosaunee went to Washington and said, this could be perceived as an act of war. You don't bestow citizenship, we are sovereign. And so they did not accept it. And then within 10 years, the United States passed the Indian Reorganization Act, where these BIA governments were kind of forced on all these territories, where they created these elective BIA puppet governments, where they enlisted Christianized Native people.
So the Haudenosaunee and the Onondaga Nation in particular, they stick to sovereignty. They insist that they are sovereign. They're not tribes, okay, as the rest of those native groups are. They're nations, okay? So that's the difference in language, right? They're not tribes, they're nations. That's why they travel on their own passports. Because they say you can't make a treaty like George Washington did in 1794. You can't make a treaty with yourself. You have to make it between sovereign nations. So they've been able to stick to this, unlike, we'll say, 99% of Native people in the U.S. So this is what's unusual about upstate New York. I'm sure you've never heard this before, so that's, and most Americans have never heard this before. So it's not you. So actually this relationship has been commemorated in a coin that was minted in 2010. So this is the arrows, the 5 nation arrows. So Kennesatego is instructing the founding fathers that if you take just one arrow, it's easily broken, right? But if you take 5 arrows from the different fires of the Haudenosaunee, and you bind it with the values of the Wampum Belt, right? The Hiawatha Belt, nobody can break that bundle. Okay? So if you look at US money, there's a clutch of arrows, or if you look on the presidential seal, you want to listen to Trump. So, but if you look on that presidential seal, there's a clutch of arrows in the eagle's talon, and that's what that refers to. So it's right there in front of us all the time.
But this symbol of the clutched arrows goes back even farther to the peacemaker
Right.
at Arnold.
Right.
That's the image he showed.
Yeah, that's
These
originally.
warring nations.
Okay, so there's, you know, I got to meet Pete Seeger before he passed away, and we had a commemoration of the Two-Row Wampum 400th anniversary in New York City. Some other things we've been involved with, this is the United Nations, where one of the chiefs is explaining all the wampum belts during the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues. And we've done that for several years now. We had a meeting. We're having continually these meetings on the doctrine of Christian discovery. This is at the Scano Center. This is an example. Now, these are Christian people that are coming to the center, and these Christian groups are repudiating the doctrine of discovery. And I want to talk about that in a minute, just for a little bit. We don't have a lot of time. Okay, so there are these competing worldviews, and a lot of it dates back to the doctrine of discovery. Just to indicate the importance of Columbus, this is a Columbus statue in the middle of Syracuse, New York, that was put up by the Italian community in 1932. It was actually a gift of Mussolini in 1932. So, you know, I think that kind of sums it up. So Columbus is standing on top of disembodied native heads. All right, so this relationship between conquest and discovery is part of our mythology in the U.S.
But there's the language from the doctrine of discovery.
Yes.
So that's the
Yeah, so we're getting to that. So beginning in the 1450s, a succession of popes authorized the seizing of lands by discoverers who are entering Africa and then eventually the Americas and everywhere else. And this issues in the age of discovery. So, you know, this is a challenge for those of us in religion, because religion was used as a weapon, essentially, against indigenous peoples. This is one quote from 1452. Pope Nicholas IV authorizes King Alfonso V of Portugal to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans. It's interesting language. So it's Muslims and pagans, you know, indigenous people, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery and to take away all their possessions and property. So discovery was about the seizing of lands. If a Christian entered non-Christian territory, the lands of the non-Christians automatically were deeded to the church or to the nation, sponsoring the expedition. This is shortly after Columbus's return. Pope Alexander VI, this infamous Pope, Borgia, I don't know if you know about the Borgia Pope, but calls for the barbarous nations to be subjugated and brought to the Catholic faith and Christian religion for the propagation of the Christian empire. So it's clearly part of an extension of the Crusades. But the English, of course, got in on this very early with the Cabot Charter in 1496. There's no image there. But Henry VII issues this charter to Cabot to seek out, discover, and find whatsoever isles, countries, and regions of the heathens and infidels that before this time had been unknown to all Christian people. So up to this point, this is about 500-year-old crazy religion talk, all right? But then in 1823, it becomes the official legal language of the United States through the Supreme Court. In this famous landmark case, the U.S., Johnson versus McIntosh, which essentially Justice Marshall uses the doctrine of discovery to appropriate all lands that are formerly native in the U.S. So this is colonialism. And it was used as recently as 2005 to turn away a court case of the Oneida, another nation of the Haudenosaunee, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg made that ruling of the decision of the court. So you have doctrine of discovery as religious talk morphing into legal frameworks, okay, of land and basically title to land. All confusing. Okay, now I'm changing topics, and we can talk about some of the recent interests. So there's a revitalization of agriculture. Native people are reintroducing their traditional foodways through a variety of corn and everything. And then in this very remarkable event that was really kind of a setup for this film that will be coming out next year, but we had the original Hiawatha Belt returned to Onondaga Lake. It was the first time it was returned, and this goes to your question earlier. You have Tadadaho there, and these kids, so they brought this 1,000-year-old belt back to the lake, and everyone's encouraged to touch it, all right, because it connects us to the past. This would drive a museum curator crazy, but it was a way that, so the kids are holding it, there's all this, commotion around it, and this was encouraged. So this is Sandy touching the belt. It was very moving. Okay, now lacrosse, and then okay, so lacrosse is renamed by the Jesuits lacrosse. The original name is Dehonchiquais, which is here, means they bump hips. And this is the creator twins, in the cosmic realm. They're always playing lacrosse. So it's called the creator's game. It's called a medicine game because they can use it as a healing. They can, anyone who's feeling badly can ask for a medicine game. So in a certain way, it's a ceremonial event, but in another way, it's a sport. Okay, and it's a very popular sport. It's the fastest growing sport in the U.S. And we've had this wooden stick festival for many years now. Sandy and I have done this since 2013 at Onondaga Lake. So part of the story of the Great Law of Peace has to do with playing lacrosse. The warring nations would play lacrosse in order to cement the peace. So what I've discovered, and now I'm teaching a class of 500 students at SU, I've discovered they really want to talk about this stuff, right? They love sports. Students love sports, but it's a way I can sneak in religion and native history, and I talk about boarding schools. It's great. So it's a very powerful way of introducing people to the Great Law of Peace through sports. I'll just show you some other. So this is a famous wooden stick maker. So the wooden stick is the traditional game. Okay, so they can only play the medicine game with the wooden stick. And some of these lacrosse players are buried with their sticks.
And that game is never public.
Yeah, it's never public. So it's just between the clans. But they love to talk about it. So this is a wooden stick maker who comes out, he talks about sticks all the time. His name's Alf Jocks. We had a wooden stick game at these are the Thompson brothers. They're very famous. None of you know who they are, but you know, but they're very famous lacrosse players from the Onondaga Nation. This is a Tadadaho, Sid Hill playing around with his son. Tadadaho grew up playing lacrosse.
And that's Onondaga Lake.
And that's Onondaga Lake behind him. In 2015, we had the World Indoor Lacrosse Championship, which brought international teams. I don't know if Lithuania has a team. I think they might, you know. I mean, it comes like there are African teams now. There are teams from all over. And right in the middle, they had a conference of this world game. I said, this isn't going to work. You know, nobody wants to have a conference in the middle of a sports event. And it did. I was really surprised. So again, so 2015 was great, and it's based on this important book called The Basic Call to Consciousness from the 70s. These are our twins. So this is with the great Jim Brown. You don't know who he is, but you know, he was a big star of American football and was first African-American player at Syracuse University.
But he loved lacrosse.
He loved lacrosse.
And he played with Orange Lions.
Right. That was his first love, he says. He loved lacrosse first. Of course, he made all his money in American football. So, and then Al Gore was there. This is my son, Clay. Al Gore is a great friend of the Onondaga Nation, and he's going to be there in the fall, I think, again. This was the opening ceremony, so you can see all the wampum belts, right? So these are lacrosse players with the wampum belts in this opening ceremony. One of these disappeared. And this is in the Carrier Dome during those 2015 games. And this is Orange Lions delivering. There's a great film now, which I can't show you because I don't have any internet, but it's called The Spirit Game. It's available on iTunes and Amazon, I think, or something.
The Spirit Game?
The Spirit Game. And it's on this event, The Spirit Game. And it combines international lacrosse with sovereignty, doctrine of discovery, issues of colonialism or decolonization, all that stuff. Really good. And this is Orange Lions giving Canada, who won the tournament, you know, it was a big game between the Iroquois Nationals and Canada in the Carrier Dome. So this is called the one bowl, one spoon wampum belt. And the bowl is the earth, and we only have one spoon that we have to share. This was our festival in 16 with dancing at the Scano Center and again wooden stick making. And this will be our event in September, a few months from now, which will combine box lacrosse, which is basically in a hockey box, with field lacrosse and the wooden stick festival. So that's coming up. And this is the last slide. Thank you. So the Great Law of Peace is this ancient story with renewed attention. It's our thinking that we need to move away from the colonial story or the doctrine of discovery story, and we need an indigenous story that's connected with our formulation as modern people. The Haudenosaunee can be our guides for peace, Scano, and the good mind, and I think we all feel that our survival depends on it. Thank you.